Grace be unto you and peace from God our Father and our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I'm sure many of you remember the old game show Password. Remember, there would come this quiet voice that would give the password. The password is. This morning, the password is crisis. Now let's think about the situation in which a crisis might occur. Whenever a nation, or maybe it's a company, or it's an organization like a church, experiences the loss of a long-time beloved leader, it can be a time of crisis. You know, the Chinese, when they spell out the word crisis, they use two characters in their alphabet. The first character stands for their concept of danger. The second character stands for their concept of opportunity. When they think of a crisis, they think both of a positive and a negative. A crisis is a time of dangerous opportunity. When we think about the succession, as we are experiencing now, from one leader to another, such a time can be a time, yes, of danger, but also of opportunity. You know, back during my school days, I competed in a lot of athletics, but my favorite, what I did the most all the way up through school, was track. Competed in a lot of individual events, did pretty well, but it was the relays that I found to be more rewarding. Working together with three other guys. Lots of relays over the years, but my favorite was my senior year, the 400-meter relay that I competed with three other guys. We won the sectional championship. We set the sectional record. The next year they switched from yards over to meters, so if you go under Sandusky Stadium, you will see the record is still there. And those three guys and I became very close. The guy that I handed off to, my best friend, still to this day, David. He's a trauma surgeon in Wichita, Kansas. The last guy of the four, Mark, was my organist at the church that I just left. Mike, out in New York City, I don't get to see him as much, but still to this day, the four of us are very close. We all had nicknames, and if I told you our nicknames, I'm being honest with you, I'd have to kill you. We had a lot of success together, but you know what? What I remember the most was the two times that we dropped the baton. Ouch. Folks, the baton pass in a relay is that moment of, shall we call it, dangerous opportunity when both runners' hands are on that baton, and that transitional period, it can either be a time of crisis, bam, everything blows up, DQ, race over, or it can be a springboard to success. Let's think of the Summer Olympics every 4 years. You might imagine track and field is my favorite event. Over the years, generally, the American men's 400-meter relay team on paper has the four fastest guys. But then they get out there and run, and do they win every 4 years? Wah, wah. You might remember the story about the young, very talented celloist invited to go play at Carnegie Hall. And so he drives in New York City. He's never been there before. He's trying to find his way to Carnegie Hall. He gets hopelessly lost, and it's getting closer and closer to the time that he's supposed to be there. And if he doesn't show up in time, they're not going to invite him back. And so finally, in desperation, he pulls up, cello in the front seat, and there's this drunk laying alongside the corner of this alley with paper bag and bottle. And he rolls down his window and he says, "Excuse me, sir, can you tell me how to get to Carnegie Hall?" And the drunk looks at him and the cello and says, "Practice, man, practice." Yeah, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Yeah, practice, man, practice. How do you win the Olympic 400-meter relay? Practice, man, practice. And you'd think these guys would practice till they had it down pat. Apparently not. So when I was a track coach, which I was back in the late 80s, a junior high girls team, I worked with those relay teams over and over again. And so that we had this smooth, seamless passes. You know, they marked their tape out here so they knew when the girl coming in got to that tape, they took off and they were in that exchange zone. And when they got up just to full speed, the girl would say, go. They'd stick back that hand and smack that baton would go in there and off they would go. We won the conference championships in the relay events. As Mickey said to Rocky, it was a thing of beauty to watch them go around that track. Well, that's exactly what Pastor Dan and I are trying to do. We had breakfast for 3.5 hours this week one day. We're trying to make a seamless exchange of the baton. No droppages. Let's think about 70 years ago. The date was April 12th, 1945, and then Vice President Harry Truman got a phone call. Come to the White House. He figured, FDR's got a job for me to do. So he got there. He was ushered into Eleanor Roosevelt's sitting room. Eleanor got up with a grave look on her face, put her hand on his shoulder, and she said, Harry, the president is dead. He was stunned. So he said, is there anything I can do for you, Eleanor? And she says, no. The question is, what can we do for you? You're the one in trouble now. Let's think about that day, what that was like. FDR was the longest sitting president in American history. He was this legend, bigger than life. World War II was going well, 1945, and yet there were decisions looming. Hitler and Japan and Stalin, the responsibility of the world was suddenly on his shoulders. He said, the next day I felt like the moon, the stars, and the planets had all landed on me. Yeah. Few assignments are more daunting than following in the footsteps of a giant. A giant's shoes are big shoes to fill, aren't they? But then again, leaders, they don't last forever, do they? Change, it's inevitable. People die, or they depart, or they retire. New problems emerge, and new challenges arise, and all of us face those times in the relay of life when the baton is passed to someone else and the next leg is there. And if we're watching from the grandstands, we might be tempted to say, hey, who's the new stiff the coach has got running in there? When did they put this guy in? I can't watch. What if he drops the baton? If you missed that, I'm the new stiff. And the Bible is literally chocked full of stories of these kinds of baton passes. And some of them went well and some not so well. Some happened in some pretty counterintuitive ways to maybe the way that we would have done things. Let's take an example from the Old Testament. Israel cries out, "We want a king! We want a king!" And so they get a king. His name was Saul. He looked like a king. He was head and shoulders taller than everybody else, tall, dark, and handsome, but he was a human choice. He made human decisions. He did not follow God, so guess how that went, right? So it was God's turn. He told his prophet Samuel, who we heard mentioned, to go to the house of Jesse. And there at the house of Jesse, Jesse lines up all of his sons, big strapping lads, and presumably the king of Israel was amongst them. And so Samuel goes down the line, and of course in the Old Testament, you know, the word ruach means spirit, but also means wind. So Jesse goes down the line, and I'm imagining him. You all the sons you have? And Jesse must have said, huh? Well, there is the runt of the litter. He's out in the back 40 with the sheep. Go get him. They bring him in. And sure enough, the runt of the litter, David, he's the man. He's the one with whom God makes an eternal covenant. Interesting passing of the baton. How about one from the New Testament? Acts chapter 1. Let's remember, here we are in a situation where there's only 11 apostles. Remember what happened to the 12th? Judas. He's out of the picture. They need to replace him with a 12th. And so what do? How do they take care of this? They cast lots. I imagine them with a bunch of rocks in a bag, and they pull one out, and it says, Matthias, you're going to be the next apostle of The Price is Right. Right? It's sort of like flipping a coin or drawing straws. Maybe you heard when they were going through the process, there were 100 people that applied for the pastor's position here. I wonder how they narrowed it down. I'm picturing them, the search committee, with the leadership in some back room, flipping coins or drawing straws. And finally they get down to the last two, and they pulled out a short straw and said, it's the Lutheran guy. Well, I don't know if you guys got the short straw or not, but here I am. But my favorite biblical baton pass is the story we heard this morning between Elijah and Elisha. In the Old Testament book of 2 Kings, actually the story starts back in 1 Kings in chapter 19. You remember Elijah has this duel with the 850 Baal prophets, and right after that God says, I want you to go, and in this field you'll find this boy, this plow boy, farm boy, and he'll be plowing with some oxen. Go and lay your mantle upon him. He's going to be your successor someday. That was probably maybe about 10 years before. So when we think about exchange zones, usually 20 yards long, this was maybe about 10 years. It's a pretty long exchange zone to get up to speed that Elisha spent with Elijah. And as we kind of open up today's story now, 10 years later, we get to hear in the opening verse, when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. So we already get a sense, the writer is trying to tell us at the very beginning, hey, something pretty amazing. This is not going to be your father's Oldsmobile. This is going to be the new can I say Oldsmobile here in Michigan? I think I can, yeah. So this is going to be a different kind of exchange than normal. And the sense I kind of get is that God must have not been real big on HIPAA laws back then, because as we read the story, it seems like just about everybody knows that Elijah's going to be going away. Sort of like, here in Douglas and Saugatuck and out in Fenville, it's a pretty small town, so, everybody knows what's happening, and somebody shares something, hey, did you hear that Pastor Dan's leaving? Like this. Did you hear about that new guy, over at Community Douglas? Word spreads pretty fast, doesn't it, in an area like this? That's pretty normal when we think about it. What we also notice in this story is it's sort of centered around a journey. Elijah, the mentor, Elisha, the successor, they move from town to town to town on this journey. And we see a couple of things happen at each stop along the way. First of all, Elijah at each stop tries to deter young Elisha from following him. Hey, this is a pretty big step that Elisha's going to be taking, filling Elijah's shoes. So maybe it's best to kind of give him an out, if possible. Is he loyal? Is he determined in this thing? So each time, he says, stay here. And each time, Elisha says, I will not leave you. It reminds you of Ruth and Naomi and that whole scene of mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Urge me not to leave you or to turn back from following you, for where you go I will go, and there I will be buried. But we also notice a second thing in each stop. We keep hearing about this supposed company of prophets. How many of you have ever had a favorite band from the 70s? And then the band from the 70s, now decades later, decides they're going to do this final farewell tour. Okay? It's going to be their swan song. So they go from town to town to town, and they say goodbye to everybody. The big victory tour goes on, and that's sort of what Elijah's doing here. He's given the opportunity as he goes from town to town to town for all his prophetic groupies. You know, he's the grand poopah, the big kahuna, to be able to say goodbye. Finally, at the end, he and young Elisha arrive at the Jordan River, and the prophetic groupies are watching off to the side, and Elijah has this opportunity to do one last great miracle. So he takes off his mantle, he rolls it up, and I'm sure with the dramatic flair, he slaps the water with it, and sure enough, the waters part from right to left. It sounds sort of familiar when you think about it. It kind of sounds like another transition in the Bible. You remember old Moses and his protege Joshua? Just remember that both Moses and Elijah, they parted waters. One, the Red Sea, the other, the Jordan River. Both used their symbols of leadership. Moses, his staff, and Elijah used his mantle. Both called down fire from heaven upon a sacrifice. Both experienced a miraculous provision of food at one time during their ministry. Both ended their earthly lives in rather remarkable ways, in that their bodies were never found. And both had significant successors who they passed the baton to. Moses with Joshua, Elijah with Elisha. And then there was that one other little thing in the New Testament. What was it? Let me think. Mount of Transfiguration. Two guys appear with Jesus in a cloud. What were their names? Oh yeah, I think it was Moses and Elijah. Just sort of coincidence, right? Didn't have anything to do with that one represented the law and the other the prophets, and both of them were saying, the law and the prophets both are saying, this is the dude. Just a coincidence, right? So Elijah and Elisha, they cross over the Jordan onto dry ground, and just then, knowing that the big moment of departure is near, Elijah asks young Elisha, hey, what can I do for you before I'm taken up? And Elisha's answer, it's interesting to me. We heard a little bit about it. How's about a double portion of the Wheaties that God's been giving you? Barkeep, I'll have a double. Give me twice as much as Elijah's been getting. And at first when we hear that, it sounds sort of presumptuous. I mean, Elijah, and here's Elisha asking for twice as much? I mean, come on, dude. We dig behind the story and we recognize this is a Hebrew idiom, and in that culture, Elijah, as he passes the mantle, Elisha knows that he's the successor. He's the spiritual heir. And as the spiritual heir, it was customary for the heir, the firstborn, to receive a double portion. And to this, when he was asked, Elijah responded, hey, you know, buddy, it's not really my call to make. it's God's. But, if God wills it and you see me called up and He gives it to you, hey, go with it. So they're walking along, and the Bible tells us in verse 11 that as they walked along and they talked together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them. And laying a finger aside of his nose and giving a nod up the chimney, he arose. And I heard him exclaim as he rode out of sight. No. Right. A little bit, you got the chariot, you got the fiery horses, you got the reindeer, you got the sleigh. It's a little bit like that. It's actually maybe a little bit more because it tells us he was taken up in a whirlwind. I'm thinking of Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz here, with all these images that we could understand today. The Bible tells us that upon seeing this, imagine you're Elisha, that he tore his clothes. Imagine you are Elisha. Wouldn't you tear your clothes? You probably would need a new set of duds. In fact, you might need a set of Depends after something like that. What an amazing thing to watch. Imagine that's the baton pass that you get to experience as Elisha. And now you're having to step into the big kahuna's shoes. I felt a little bit like that last Sunday. No, Pastor Dan maybe didn't get carried out of here by a chariot of fire, but he was up here preaching. He even had to pull out his handkerchief and mop his brow. He was on fire, wasn't he? I was thinking, I got to get up next and follow that. I have a little bit of feeling how Elisha must have felt. So we all gathered up here last Sunday, and sort of the hug that Pastor Dan and I gave each other, totally unplanned, that was a genuine thing. And then the laying on of hands was sort of that pass of the baton. So we see in our story that there was Elijah's mantle laying there. And Elisha picked it up, and he took that same mantle that Elijah had just struck the water with, and he struck the water as well, and sure enough, the water parted. And as it did, he cried out, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" I don't think that was a question. I think that was a petition on Elisha's part, in which he was asking God, Father, give me that same spirit that you gave to Elisha. And so I might say, Lord, as I begin my ministry here, give me that same spirit to lead among your people that you gave to Pastor Dan here. Upon seeing that company of prophets, the groupies who are watching on, first of all, they recognize that yes, the spirit of Elijah is now with Elisha. I pray that might happen here as well. But then secondly, we notice a very natural and human thing unfold. They said to Elisha, let us go and look for your master. Isn't that so normal? Yeah, we want to go and reproduce the past and keep things the same. And why? Because change is hard, isn't it? Of course, you all know the 7 last words of the church, don't you? We've never done it that way before. Yeah, after 35 years of Pastor Dan's ministry, it will be natural to want to go and look for him and the ways that he did things. I get that big time. It's hard to let go. And like Elisha told those prophets when they went out looking for Elijah and they couldn't find him, so I could tell you, don't go. But I won't. Because we each need to grieve in our own way. We each have to let go in our own time. It's hard to not go looking for an Elijah or a Pastor Dan. Wouldn't any of us? Friends, let's finish this morning with 3 very short and simple principles that I believe we can take away with us. First of all, when God's leader is removed, remember everything of God still remains. Let me say that again. When God's leader is removed, everything of God still remains. And that's to say that Israel, they didn't really need Elijah. They needed the God of Elijah. And that reminds us that such times as these, they are times to refocus on the God of the man, not the man of God. The Lord is God. Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? Elisha said. He is our focus, not Pastor Dan or Pastor Jeff or any other leader. That's the first thing to leave with today. But secondly, when God lays aside one tool, history teaches us that He picks up another. After all, He has this inexhaustible tool chest. The work of the Lord goes on even though the workers change. And that's true for pastors as well as for lay people. None of us are indispensable. And maybe that's why the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 reminds us of this. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. Isn't it amazing that God works through crackpots like us? Jars of clay. And finally, remember those unforgettable words from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. There's a time and a season for everything under God's heaven. Moses had his season. He had a particular role in God's plan. He was the shepherd that led Israel to the border of the Promised Land. But they were going to need a warrior to lead them into the Promised Land, Joshua. Elijah had particular gifts. He was larger than life. He played the role that God intended. But then came Elisha, a farm boy, a plow boy, sort of like me. I'm just a farm boy from Ohio, folks. 2 different men, 2 unique and different ministries for the seasons of the life of God's people. And my sense is, as I have talked with some of you, that you sense that despite your love for Pastor Dan, a love that will never change or wane, that you hear that same whisper, that still small voice that spoke to Elijah in the whirlwind. And it's saying, behold, I am doing a new thing. There's a time and a season for everything, including here at the Community Church of Douglas. Thank God that the God who neither slumbers or sleeps is the same God who is coaching sovereignly, watching over us as that baton is being passed. And all of God's people said together, amen. Father, we give you thanks that you are watching over all that is going on. We put our congregation, our life, the journey ahead your vision, your purpose for us into your almighty hands. We ask that you guide us each and every step of the way so that the baton will not be dropped. This we ask in your mighty name.